Alright, welcome. This is my second developer log for my total conversion mod Ehrlia for the Rage engine or IDTECH5 engine. And today I wanted to show you the engine, the toolkit, basically go over the basics, what I've learned so far, and I'm starting to learn other things too, which I'll put in the second video having to do with models and definition files. But this time I'm just going to do kind of an introduction, and if anyone wants to use this toolkit, the Rage Toolkit, or in the future of course be releasing probably my own tools or plugins, but there's a lot you can do with this toolkit, and if for any reason anyone in the future uses it, which is doubtful because I think the last mod was in 2014 or something, 2016 maybe, but there is no mods. I mean, those are just changes to the shader file or a rebalancing mod. So nothing's been done ever on this engine, which to me is very surprising because people love IDTech and there's so many developers and modding. There's such a big modding community with IDTech. Now, of course, it makes sense. This engine was released about 2 years after the game, and it's missing a lot. I have to do a lot of work on it to fix it. But there's actually a lot more here than I thought there would be from what I was researching. There's basically Radiant, there's every single editor you can think of, and it really takes games to the modern era. Because you have Mega Texture Editor, Mega Terrain Editor, where you can add foliage and drop, and it operates just like any modern engine where you can basically paint a terrain, etc. But I'm just going to start and go into what I've learned so far, and how to use Radiant, and what the engine is, and the folders, and what they mean, and the files, etc. So, right now we're staring at, this is the toolkit. Now, this toolkit has changed, and I'll just turn the music off here too, but the toolkit has changed now because what I've done is I've put a bunch of files into the mod folder and maps folder. When the mod folder gets too full, and I'm gonna show you here this is the actual mod folder, and to open the toolkit you go into Steam apps where your normal games would be, and whenever you create a mod for this, and you create that in Radiant, and I'll show you how, but whenever you create a mod for this game, it makes a folder. And so these are just, I think, this is when I was starting out, I made these maps because I didn't know that you could do what I'm about to show you. But let's say we go into cannabis, right? There's two folders. There's a base folder, and base folder contains the resources for your file. A resource file is basically what any IDTECH5 game uses. But what this is basically like an archive that contains all of the assets for your game, or for your game. So it contains maps, models, textures, etc. And you can open these files, but you have to find a specific extractor online to do so, and I might get into that later. But it contains virtual textures, and then the resource file, and then gives some information about the mod. Pretty simple. How many maps are in it, the name of the map, etc. Anyways, when you get more folders than 6 here, what happens is the menu in Rage changes. And I don't know why this happens, but it does. And it was funny because I started this and I remember how it originally looked. Right? Where basically you couldn't do anything. There was no Idstudio, or maybe I'm back at the original. I'm sorry. This is the original menu, but you will get to a menu if you have too many mods and too many maps. It's supposed to be 6, I don't know why it's happening, where Idstudio in this menu disappears and it's a different menu. And then I was confused because I was thinking, well, how do I access Idstudio? There's no executable. And Idstudio, by the way, is the Radiant editor. So I finally figured out that you open the console. So you press the tilde key to open the console. And you simply type in Idstudio. And if you type in Idstudio, because your menu probably will change from what it is. I don't know why my menu is like this. It shouldn't be. But you type Idstudio, and now it will open the toolkit, basically. Now, when the toolkit opens, there's going to be 3 tabs here on the top. Idstudio Help, and this is the tutorials and the FAQ and the EULA, etc. And there's some tutorials here. I learned some things from them, but very minimal information that they give you. But you can use this when you're starting out. Use some of the tutorials. But the second button here is called World Edit. And this is essentially Radiant. So everyone who's modded before for any id software game has used Radiant. And then Engine, and this is a really cool feature too, is that you can actually, we're still in the game here with the engine. It's just switched what we had seen previously to this tab. So you can basically test your map on the go without having to open up the shortcut again and load Rage. So I'm going to go over Radiant and everything here, and most of what's here is actually similar to the old Radiants. So I'm not going to go over how to build a brush, patching, splines, etc. I'm just going to go over specific things you're going to need to know to use Radiant with the toolkit. So first here we have our world camera. Now that's you know, every Radiant has a world camera. Now I'm going to show you how I've set it up. This is the easiest way I've found to use the world camera, and that is that I've toggled on fast camera movement, and I've done Quake WASD camera movement. Now what this allows me to do is I can use my right click to basically look around, and then if I use my mouse wheel, I can go forwards, I can go backwards, and then if I want to go up or down, higher or lower, I press the D or the C key. And anyways, I found this is the easiest way to do this. And of course, when you build a brush, there's no texture associated with it, so you get this brush like this. Okay, so there's a couple other things you might want to know. We have MIP, and MIP determines the level, the quality of the texture. So 3 is high quality, 0 is low quality, and I don't find there's much difference. I haven't actually applied any textures yet, but I'll get to that. You go to quality, you go to high or low. Now the higher that the MIP is, or the higher the quality, you know, slower performance, but I don't notice any slowdowns on my computer. And then one of the most useful features that you can use in the world camera is called render. When you click on render, okay, I'm going to have to actually build a scene here if we're going to get this working. I'll just build a scene quickly. I'll do a box. hollow box. I'll choose some textures here. Okay, and I'll add a player start. And this is the important part. This is how you're going to see in the render what's going on. Because the render is going to show you the world camera as it would be seen in the game. Okay, so here's a light. And I'm going to get to lighting later, but click on render, right? I have this weird glitch right now in Radiant where I'm stuck in this default texture box. And usually it has to do with lights. But if I deselect the light, then it's going to go away. So anyways, this is a rendered scene. This is with the lighting and everything. And I could add also a model. Let's see. I'll add some rebar. Yeah, see, models are doing it too. Yeah, and these are the shadows that this light is making. Anyways, I'm trying to think what else I can show in the world camera. If there's anything specific, this anything that's new to this. Well, one thing is whenever you're going to be using render and you change a brush or you change anything in the room, you have to refresh it. So I'll show you something here. Yeah, right, and then escape. Oh, it doesn't show it there, but usually, okay, when you're working with brushes, you have to refresh. And you can also do it where it's real-time rebuild, but that's going to really slow down your computer. I don't recommend it. And cubic, yeah, that's the same. So that's all the same there with the world camera. I don't really know what else to go into there. Okay, so this is going to be a big portion now I'm going to go into. I'm going to go into textures. And as we have seen, I went into a folder here. Now, one thing about Rage is there's a lot of files and directories that are kind of hidden that are hard to find that I haven't found yet. So for example, I have a couple ideas and I've tried to find where textures are located. If you go to base, you go to textures. These are the textures in their normal form. That is in their TGA form. Every file that Rage uses has to be in TGA. Now later the TGA form will be taken by it will be built and compressed into something called a B model. And the B model is where the textures will be stored to be used in the game. Now I'm going to see if I can remember where to find the B model. Right, textures. So go to, or sorry, sometimes it's B model. I think it's B image actually. But this is an example. They're generated. So unfortunately, when you go into the Rage Toolkit, the textures you see here are what have been generated already. And if you just, copy textures to where you think you would copy them in textures, they won't show up in Radiant. So you have to generate the textures from where they are. So to do that, what you would do is you go to Media Browser, and then you can go here, Textures folder, right? Let's see here. Okay, so this is a folder I made, and I've already generated it, but what you would do is you would right click on this, and then you would click Generate Material. It says already exists, but if it didn't already exist, it would show up. Now if I go to Materials, I'm in the wrong folder now. I would go to here, and not a good thumbnail, but there's something there. It doesn't understand the shadow map and the light map. That's why it's making it look this way. But I could go like this, right? And again, I have to refresh the render to do that. There it is, right? There's the tree bark. Now, whenever you select a texture, it opens up something called the Material Inspector. The Material Inspector is very useful because, and there you go, I'm going to show you something too. But the Material Inspector is useful because you can define which texture is going to be used as a diffuse map, a shadow map. You can change also other principles of the texture. You can make it into water, you can make it that you float through it. You can change a lot in the material definition in the Material Inspector. Let me just show you the common water file that's used in this game and what the material definition would be. Right, so I'll make this into water. And I'm just going to go out of the renderer because we don't have any point to be in there. And then I don't have to refresh and rebuild everything when I change a brush. But you see they're using an if statement. But they're attaching a color, they're attaching the texture, and then they're attaching flags and surface type, right? Water, it's not solid, it's a liquid. And they're taking away shadows from this texture. No shadows are allowed. So that's an example there of material definition. Now, one thing I'll also go over too is that you'll see how they've sorted their files here. And if it says local, local is usually the bump map. So if you see something that says local, I'll just open it here. Or maybe not, but it's probably going to load in a second here. There's a lot going on in the background with recording, but local files are always bump maps, and there's also other types of maps too, right? There's shadow mapping, there's light mapping, etc. So those are going to be stored in here, but they're going to be a different name. The only thing that you need to know is that local refers to the bump map, and that can be specified in the Material Inspector for any texture that you load in here. Now with textures as well, it's important to understand that these textures will, when they're built, what happens is they're built into what is called an M2 file, which is a megatexture file. So even this simple room, and this is one of the drawbacks about IDTECH5 and the megatexture technology, it's going to take everything as it is, and then it's going to basically bake it into a giant texture, and which is going to be associated with the map. Which is kind of unfortunate because it's taking all this data that doesn't need to be taken and baking it, but it basically creates something called an M2 file. And that's important because that's another file that is texture. You have, I thought it was B model, but maybe it's B image. So you have B image, you have TGA files, and then you have M2 files. Now, if you explore these are the main materials. If you explore them, you will find something similar to any other Radiant games. You have the clipping textures you can use. you have all sorts of artificial intelligence, like portals, obstacles, solids. For artificial intelligence, you have caulk, you have water. Now that's a blood pool. Glow, right? That's a particle. It's supposed to be a particle. If you just apply it, it'll act like a window. And things that prevent shooting, right? Like if you hit a piece of metal, it's going to make a sound, it's going to bounce off in a certain way if you use this texture, etc. You have, of course, the ladder, and you have liquid. But usually, if I'm going to make a brush that is water, something you can swim, I use water. And then what you want to do too is if you click on here, you can convert it so that it has waves, so that it has almost bump mapping attributes, so it looks like real water. It's not just a block of water. And for that, you go into something like function. You could change it to dynamic or dynamic water. And there's different functions that you can apply to textures, and that would be one of them. Emitter is another one for lights. But that's the basics of what you will find in common and what you're going to be using in your map outside of the normal textures. You're going to be using a lot of these common textures like water, clipping, that kind of thing, right? And so these are all different textures that they've given you, and they haven't given you all the textures. There's only about a third of what the game actually has. Now, if you go into a folder, let's say you go into Deindustrial City. Right now you'll notice that there's a lot of files here that don't have a thumbnail. Now you can try to go regenerate thumbnails. You can also try to just refresh if you see there's no thumbnail. But usually what it's actually telling you, and the coders have actually put this into Radiant, is that these are tiles that are not used and are kind of like fluff. You're not going to need them. Now, let's see. This is a big folder. It's going to take a while to update the thumbnails now. I just canceled. But if you don't want to see all this fluff and they're pictures that don't really mean anything, what you want to do is you want to... one sec, now it's all slow. Okay. You want to toggle, if you don't want... Let's go to a different folder here. Okay. If you don't want all these thumbnails, just hit this button here, and this will remove all those needless thumbnails that you don't want. And I really like this house texture. This is a really kind of pretty texture that they've included here. And you can adjust the size of everything here. So, you click on render, and that's what it's going to look like when you load. There's not going to be the purple. The seams aren't going to be there, of course, and the objects aren't going to be selected as the way they are. Okay, so I think I've basically gone over how to load textures, how to generate them, how to change bump mapping, etc. The only other thing that you really need to know is the surface editor. If you click on an object, you hit S, it'll load the surface editor. Now the surface editor, you can change the position of a texture, you can rotate it, you can scale it, I can make it, say, more dense. Fit. Well, that makes it less dense, but I go back to 1. Fit. Wow, so let's go to 10. Fit it for 10. There we go, see? So I've just basically compressed it heavily. It's very small now. You can subdivide it, make it look even prettier than it is, let's say. Have more detail if you subdivide. But that's also important because you'll be moving around your textures, right? So, I mean, you look at this texture here. That doesn't make any sense that the bricks are like a meter above the ground. So, do it properly. You put it to 0.1. Oh, that's not bad. Now, it's a big texture, right? I'd have to stretch it so it doesn't do it up there. But that gives you an idea how I just moved the bricks down to the bottom so it actually fits. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say about textures and using them. One last thing I will say is when you generate a texture, like I said, when I was starting, I was talking about this folder here under generated. Now most IDTech games, if you IDTECH5 games, if you want to go into Wolfenstein or Doom and actually get the assets, you want to go into something called the generated folder, and there would be a folder either MD6 or models where you can copy the models, for example, from Wolfenstein that are, and this is Rage, but it'll be the same format, BMD6 model. So what is created for the game is always in the generated folder, right? So whenever I hit generate on the material that was in the texture folder, it in physical form it is now here in a B image, which we can't edit, by the way, or I haven't figured out how to yet, but it's compressed. It's in this thing called a B image, which eventually will also be compressed and built with the map into a resources file. Okay, so let's go into models here. There's two ways to load models, either through entity or model. Now, entity, as everyone knows that has used Radiant, what entity does is basically it makes an object do something. So you have a door. You have an object that you can break. You have a minigame trigger. You have a player start, etc. So, for example, let's say I wanted to add a weapon that you can pick up. Well, that would be under something called prop, and that's where basically everything is that you can pick up. And so if I wanted to do a weapon, I'd go down to weapon, right, and then I could choose, let's say I do pistol, and I'm going to show you this for a reason. It's going to take a while to load here. Okay, that doesn't look like a pistol, does it? Well, see, I've been fooling around with the models, and I replaced, let's see if we can find it. We're working on this tree model for Rage. That's not complete, but I was just fooling around with models, and I basically overwrote the pistol model with a tree. But let's try, you know, a different model that's not the pistol. So, nail gun, right? Now, interestingly enough, I think I was messing around with nail gun. If you ever see, when you're loading a model or an entity, this box, that means that it can't find the model. And if you try to build your game, this either isn't going to be here or it's going to give you an error. So let's see, I'm not having much luck here with the weapons, but let's see here. Let's try crossbow. There we go. So, right, this is a normal model crossbow. In Rage, when you place a model down, it just sits there, and then if you point the cursor on it, you can pick it up. I want to change it to where it's like the Quake games, where it's going to be spinning and you just run into it and pick it up. But this is essentially the weapons that you would use, and under props as well, you have health, you have everything else that you can basically build a deathmatch level with. And, so I'll delete that. So, that's what entities are. But of course, not all entities contain all the models. There's some models that are not entities. Tons of models that aren't, of course. But you could go back into let's see. Well, you got weapons. So you could go into models for pistols, right? Now I've replaced this, again with a tree. But this is called pistol pickup. So this is the item that you'll see. And there's other ones too. And I've replaced things. There's Fat Boy ammo, there's the pistol itself. I've also replaced, let's see if I can find the original pistol. That was kind of me working on my own pistol. Right? But let's go, we were doing the crossbow in the game. So, crossbow pickup. Okay? Exact same thing. And if I load it into my map, since this model is assigned to an entity, it's still going to have the entity properties if I load the model. So I can still pick this up. It's not just a model. But there's tons of other models, of course, that you need that are not entities, like trim for building, architecture, etc. So let me give you an example. If you go to map objects, you go to prison, there's all these different items in here which are basically just decoration, right? Now let's take off the wireframe mode. That's a pipe. That's very common in modern games.